Good afternoon. Ahlan wa sahlan, ladies and gentlemen, your distinguished guests. Wonderful to have you here for the afternoon session at ADIPEC. My name's Richard Dean. I'm a journalist and broadcaster based here in the UAE, and it is my honor and my privilege to be your master of ceremonies, your moderator for the next 40 minutes. And over the next 40 minutes, we are going to solve, it's a big, bold claim, but we're going to solve some of the world's biggest problems. And the way we're going to do that is by hearing from a truly fabulous speaker. He is one of the world's most renowned and acclaimed futurists. His day job is as the founder and CEO of the 311 Institute. More importantly, he's the guy who governments turn to, who companies turn to solve some of these big problems. If I was going to rattle off his list of clients, we'd be here all afternoon. Mazda, here in Abu Dhabi. The Dubai Future Foundation, down the road in Dubai. Samsung, the United Nations. I could go on, but you get my point. Please join me in welcoming our speaker today, Matt Griffin.
Thank you, Richard.
Not at all. Have a seat, Matt.
It's good to have you with us now. Say hi, everyone.
So I want to begin with a definition. The future is 38 minutes from now when we wrap up. It's 38 years from now. What's the most important bit of the future that you look at?
Ooh.
The time horizon.
So I look at two time horizons. So I look at what I call the future and the deep future. And the reason why I look at two time horizons is because if you have a look at multinational organizations, the likes of Samsung, ARM, et cetera, they typically care about the next 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 20 years. If you have a look at Abu Dhabi ports, if you have a look at DP World, they care about a sort of longer timeline, particularly when it comes to things like new port investments, et cetera. But from a government perspective, the vast majority of governments care about the kind of the near future, the next 20 years, because they want to get re-elected fundamentally. But they also care about the next 20 to 50 years. So, for example, if you actually have a look, right here in the Emirate, we care about the year 2071 because by the year 2071 it's going to be the UAE centennial, and then at that point we want to be the happiest nation on earth. So there's a huge amount of infrastructure investment. There are huge numbers of conversations going on around the future of energy, transportation, education and skills, jobs, healthcare, welfare state and all that sort of stuff. So really it's two. But in terms of the most important part of the future, you kind of got to argue it's kind of the here and now. You have to live in the here and now. It's all very well talking about the future, but fundamentally, it's what we're experiencing now that actually matters because we can change the future.
It reminds me of John Maynard Keynes, the economist. In the long run, we're all dead.
Although I have a story about that.
Go on.
Well, if you want a random tangent. So, have any of you heard of a concept called digital humans? So digital humans, we have companies like Soul Machines that are creating lifelike human avatars. So these lifelike human avatars have neural network brains. Now, over in the US, there are 5 Fortune 100 CEOs that are currently cloning themselves. So they are training these digital humans with their experience, knowledge, their language, their behaviors, emotions, all these different kinds of things, so that when they actually pass away, and this is literally no joke, so when they actually pass away, the boards of those companies that they served on can dial them up and say, John, the year is 2040, we're thinking about doing an M&A between DP World and Abu Dhabi ports, what do you think? That's it, and John can get dialed up. And then outside of that, we have a huge amount of anti-aging technology in the healthcare sector itself. By 2028, the healthcare sector estimates that they will be able to add more than 1 year's worth of life to everybody for 1 year that you live. So when we talk about breakthroughs in healthcare, there are some truly science fiction-like things going on.
I tell you what, if you could...
That's a different industry.
If you could predict mergers between Dubai and Abu Dhabi entities, that's a parlour game we all play. Yeah. We did get one with the aluminium, didn't we? Emirates Global Aluminium, so it can happen.
Kazad, yeah.
Doesn't mean it will, but it can happen. I tell you what, I think... Well, let me throw this out here. You're based in the UK, aren't you? Just outside London, but you've spent a lot of time working here. I think actually one of the things we do well here in the UAE is medium to long-term planning. And I think we actually do it better than a country like the UK. You talked about election cycles. And
Yeah.
if you're an elected politician, you can't think beyond the next 2, 3, 4 years because you want to get re-elected. But here you can have vision and think more long term. There's a 2021 plan, a 2030 plan, a 2050 plan, and you mentioned the centennial, 2071. So a thesis that I'll throw out is that actually here in the Gulf, and not just the UAE, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, we're actually quite good at looking to the future and planning to the future because we don't have that 4-year, 5-year election cycle. Is there any validity to that?
No, absolutely. So on the one hand, long term, governments basically actually have to plan. So this is where you end up with a 2030, 2040, 2050 plan, basically like we see in Abu Dhabi, like we see basically for the Emirate. However, fundamentally, when we really boil things down, certainly in democracies, presidents, prime ministers, ministers want to get re-elected. And it's all very well actually having conversations with the populace, for example, saying, so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be investing £100 billion in a new energy and transportation system, for example, as we're doing in the UK. And the people go, well, okay, that's great. You know, being able to travel from A to B, for example, Dubai to Abu Dhabi on a Hyperloop within 12 minutes, basically that's good. But I actually have problems today, you know, whether it's personal, whether it's professional, whether it's your own family, for example, you know, future of education, jobs and skills, poverty, wealth gaps, energy poverty, hunger, all these kinds of different things. And so, and this is sort of the balancing act that a lot of politicians have to have. On the one hand, they've got to plan for the future, but on the other hand, they've got to actually get elected every 4 years in order to execute that future. And as we saw with President Trump and Biden now, President Trump unwound over 8 years' worth of Obama's policies. He was in power for about 4 years, which means that from a US perspective, the US went backwards by about 12 years. And when you have conversations, basically over in China, they go, that's brilliant. The American government couldn't have done anything better than actually elect him, because that's allowed us to catch up. So when we start looking at politics, there's this increasing question of what's more powerful, individuals, private organizations, or politicians. And if you think about it like this, you know, President Xi, for example, looks over a population about, 1.2 billion people. You know, Biden looks over a population of about 350 million people, so they control basically their own sort of, you know, hard and soft political stances. Mark Zuckerberg looks over a population, a virtual country of 2.2 billion people. In fact, it's actually 3.2 billion people. So who's more powerful? Who can change if they wanted to and were allowed? Who's going to be better positioned to change global culture? Zuckerberg, Xi, or Biden? And on the Facebook side of things, Facebook in 2017 ran a rather illegal experiment where they modified the algorithm. So when you looked at your news feeds, some of the news feeds you'd be shown, some people were shown happy news feeds, other people were shown negative news feeds. And Facebook was doing a social experiment that the US Congress then slapped them around the head for, and they were able to demonstrate that the algorithm that they used affected global mood. Biden and Xi can do that by having narky conversations with one another. That's it. But that shows the kind of world that we now live in, this public-private kind of partnership as well.
Let's get your thoughts on future planning, because we do love a good 20, 30, 40-year strategic plan here, particularly in the Gulf. And I want to know, it's a simple yes or no answer. Are you a fan of the kind of, you know, multi-decade strategic plan? Vision 2030 in Saudi Arabia is probably the most high profile at the moment. There's the 2071 one they have in the UAE. But are these things, are they actually good for the country? Do they work? Or are they just good for McKinsey because they earn good fees putting them together? So show of hands, first of all, if you are a fan of the multi-decade futuristic strategic plan. Okay, I'd say that's more than half of the room. And I'm putting my hand up. I actually think they're quite good. I've been here 23 years, and I think they've worked. I think Sheikh Rashid in Dubai, where I live, had one in the 60s, and you'd say it's worked. But I could be wrong. Who thinks, nah, they're only good for McKinsey and the consultants who produce them? Okay, so we're not that cynical in the room. Does that surprise you?
No.
Which way would you vote?
So you need a long-term plan, but you need to be able to execute it on the ground. So giving you an example, let's take jobs. So for example, basically with the RTA, you have thousands of cab drivers, and we know that fully autonomous vehicles basically are going to be coming into play. Now, if you don't plan for the future, this happens. At some point in about 2025 onwards, the RTA says to all of the taxi drivers, thank you very much for your service, in some case decades of service. We have just bought 10,000 fully autonomous Teslas, which actually the UAE is kind of done, but smaller number, and you have now all been made redundant. Now, at that point, all those taxi drivers will say, well, hang on, that's really unfair. We didn't know about this. You know, yesterday I was employed. Today I'm not employed. What do I do now? You know, I've got a family to feed. So if you do short-termist thinking, that's what happens. However, if we can actually see the future, we can say this. We can say to the taxi driver, okay, the year is 2021. In 2025, we think that the RTA are going to start investing in fully autonomous vehicles, and your job is at risk. And the RTA can go to the taxi drivers as well and say the same thing. And the taxi drivers think, well, you know what, it's 4 or 5 years away, not too fussed at the moment, urgency's low, a bit like COVID, there's no immediacy. But the RTA can plan. So the RTA can now say, however, so in 2025, we might make you redundant. But because we are going to use teleoperations for some of these vehicles, what we're going to do is we're going to train you from being a taxi driver to being a teleoperator, if you're willing. The taxi drivers basically go through a new training program, and when the fully self-driving vehicles actually hit the Sheikh Zayed Road, the RTA goes to the taxi driver and say, you are no longer a taxi driver, we're making you redundant. But as opposed to now panicking about how they feed their family, they say, that's fine, I'll just take up my new teleoperator job with the RTA. Oh, actually, and it's higher skilled, higher paid. I might move house, buy a bigger house. That's the difference between short-term planning, and there's loads of these different examples. That's the difference between short-term planning and long-term planning. Even if we have a look at things like food, the UAE imports 97% of all of its food. We have 2 key technologies coming. So we have vertical farms, which allow you to grow 8 times, crops with 8 times the yield, fully organic, based on the Sheikh Zayed Road to push into Dubai Mall. So you no longer have to import lettuce and other tier 3 vegetables and things. I can take the feather from a chicken, put it into a bioreactor, put the bioreactor up at Masdar or in the middle of the desert, and you can have chicken nuggets. And one of the biggest problems that some of the UAE food regulators actually have is when they go to food companies who are importing, they say, as the UAE, these are our food standards, and we want you to actually, we want you to adhere to them. And the food companies generally say, no. This way, the UAE can say, you know what? Firstly, we don't need the food companies because we're now making everything within the emirate. But secondly, because we've got lots of space, we can scale these new food production techniques, and we become a net exporter. A little bit like you're doing with hydrogen, for example. You know, you can make it here, export it. So all of a sudden, basically, all of these new different technologies allow the UAE to do new things in new ways. But again, coming back to that, if you had a short-term view, you'd never invest in any of these things. And in 10 years' time, you'd still be importing 97% of food from the people who were using vertical farms in Saudi Arabia, for example, and then selling it to you.
Well, let's do a bit of a deep dive on food, because it's a massive one here. And certainly, I mean, you spend a lot of time in the UAE, but the drive, even pre-COVID, to produce a lot more of our food here in the UAE was very real. And Mariam Al-Mahari, the minister, spearheading that, but others as well. You've got entrepreneurs. Has anyone tried the tomatoes from Pure Harvest Smart Farms in Al Ain, I think, isn't it? And they're really nice tomatoes. They're sweet and they're lovely and juicy. But can we scale that? Can we scale that? So now Pure Harvest and others are growing really only 4 or 5 things. Tomatoes, they can do lettuce,
Yeah.
and on a good day they can do a strawberry, but the economics don't really stack
Yeah.
up, which is fine, but that's not that's not a game changer, is it?
So at the moment, from a vertical farm perspective, we can grow what we call tier 3 crops. So those are your typical salad crops. Then we want to move to tier 2 crops, basically which are fruits. And then we want to move to tier 1 crops, which really are things like wheat, barley, rice, and everything else. If you want to grow rice, basically then you need a dwarf rice. So when we actually have a look at the unit costs, there's a company called Iron Ox, basically, which has a fully autonomous vertical farm. And in terms of actual scaling, in terms of physical scaling, just build a bigger warehouse. So, for example, when we have to look at Kizad, basically there are vertical farms going into containers, basically in Kizad. We've got companies like EMIC, basically that sort of been investing in vertical farms here. But when it comes to growing new crops, on the one hand, you can use genetic engineering. But on the other hand, it's a process. So what we're doing is we're turning farming and food production into a manufacturing process that allows us to not only drop costs, but now if you have a look at companies like Plenty, so Jeff Bezos invested over $250 million in Plenty. We've got Aero Farms out of New York. They can now grow 20 crops.
And what about non-meat meat? You talked about the chicken feather?
Yeah, chicken feather.
The chicken feather. So will the lines become blurred between what is essentially plant-based meat, like the Beyond Burger or the Impossible Burger, and meat that's grown in a lab? Are they going to meet, or will they be different things?
They're going to be different things.
Are they?
But the reason for that is, so when we talk about, with the work that I do with the United Nations, one of the things that always crops up, for example, is by 2050, we will have 11 billion people on the planet. We have a growing middle class, especially basically in Asia, and we can't feed them enough protein. So that's why China, for example, has recently purchased $300 million worth of lab-made meat from Israel, so from Aleph Farms. But at the moment, basically, you've got plant-based meat. So you've got, from a climate change perspective in the COP26, agriculture accounts for about 25% of all CO2 emissions, let alone methane emissions. So on the one hand, basically, we have the technologies to literally revolutionize the entire agricultural industry, just as we are basically with the energy industry. But you can have a plant-based meat, you can have a plant-based burger, but if you actually want a fillet steak burger, a chicken burger, a beef burger, you can have one of those anyway. That's it. So unless you actually want plants, basically, in your beef burger, which will probably happen, you don't need to. And this is the key, this is the crucial thing. In the US Farmers Associations actually took the clean meat organizations to court because they said, you are taking a cell from an animal, growing it in a bioreactor, and creating a fillet steak. You cannot call that meat, even though it is meat, because we are replicating what an animal does inside its body, outside of its body. Same with fish, and so tuna and salmon and everything else. And the US House of Representatives passed a bill called the H881 bill that said if you are producing lab-made meat in this way, you have to label it as lab-made meat. And the US Farmers Association thought, you know what, job done. And this is disruption in action. This is what always happens with industries that are being disrupted. The market, they thought, we've taken these new guys to court and we won. At which point the investors went and the market went and the consumers went, don't care. Okay, fine. We just have to label this up as a plant burger or as a lab-grown meat burger. That's a marketing exercise. And these startups are multi-billion dollar. And they are seen as a prime way to resolve UN SDG 1, which is poverty. Not poverty, which is food.
Let's talk about transport. Let's talk about 16 days to build a battery.
Okay. So bring us to energy. So one of the things basically that we're actually seeing across the board, and you see it here especially within the UAE, is the speed of change. If I ask you, do you think things are changing faster now than they were 10 years ago? Do you think they are moving faster now than they were 10 years ago? Everyone's nodding pretty much. If I asked you this question, if we were sitting here in 2030, do you think in 2030 things, life, development of new products, industries are going to be moving faster than they are today or slower. So who thinks we're going to be moving faster in the future, not slower? Okay. When I ask that question all the way around the world, it's exactly the same response. Now, just to prove this point, from an energy perspective, you are in an asset-heavy industry. It's going to take $600 billion a year just to keep the oil and gas industry producing the number of barrels it needs to produce for the future. So, heavy asset industry. What you are having to grapple with is the speed of change. And to put this into context, if you went back 5 years ago and you had conversations with all of the 20 CEOs of the automotive industries and automotive manufacturers and said, okay, in 5 years' time, do you think that you're going to be producing electric vehicles, let alone providing them as a service? They all said no. And they said that to the CEO of the IEA. When he asked that same question about 2 months ago, 18 out of the 20 CEOs said the future of transportation is purely electric. Whether it's lithium-ion, basically, and hydrogen, we can discuss that. But when we talk about the speed of change, it would ordinarily take about 2 years to create a next-generation electric vehicle battery. One company used a creative artificial intelligence, which is a type of artificial intelligence that can simulate new products and design new products at extreme speed in 16 days. So within 16 days, this particular company that you all know developed a next-generation electric vehicle battery and tested it, and then started integrating it into their vehicles, and that company is Toyota. So when you start having a look at the trajectory of different energy technologies, solar, wind, lithium-ion batteries and everything else, we aren't on this linear graph any longer. We're doing this. So when we start talking about the battle of fuel cell vehicles versus lithium-ion vehicles, and we look at the energy density of lithium-ion batteries today, and we say, well, we need a queen-size bed's worth of batteries in our Teslas or electric vehicles today, and tomorrow we'll still need that, there are two things I can counter with. We have a next-generation battery for electric vehicles that is 300% more energy dense than anything that we have on the market, which means I can eliminate 60% of lithium-ion batteries in my vehicle, and I can charge it 500% faster.
That's real?
Yeah. So I've got a better one. And I can charge that wirelessly. So companies like BMW, Hyundai, Toyota, you can charge these wirelessly. So that affects the supercharging infrastructure that you actually put into the UAE, but also around the world. However, we have polymer batteries coming through. Polymer batteries will charge an electric vehicle to a full charge, a 450-mile charge, basically in some EVs cases, within about 3 seconds. We have solid-state batteries coming through. If you 3D print a lithium-ion battery, bearing in mind that 3D printing is an advanced technology that we're already using in the Emirate to 3D print office buildings as well as government buildings and other things. If I 3D print a lithium-ion battery, and we've done this, I can have a battery that is 400% more energy dense than anything on today's market, that charges over 500% faster. Because when you have a look at the cathodes and the anodes in a lithium-ion battery, it's all about surface area. And as we see improvements in 3D printing, you can print at the nanoscale, which means that what we have is we have anodes and cathodes basically with massive surface areas. So when we have a look at the future of lithium-ion batteries within electric vehicles, we already see a way to reduce them down to pretty much nothing. We see a way to wirelessly charge them. We see a way to replace them. And then in addition to that, we also have the technology to put carbon nanotubes into, say, carbon fiber or different materials, and I can turn the shell of the car itself into the battery.
So what does that mean very quickly for Elon Musk's gigafactories that he's making? Are they obsolete already?
No, because when you actually have a look at a lot of the technologies that he's actually deploying, he's already lining up these technologies like 3D printed batteries, basically like energy-dense batteries. He's actually taking cobalt out of lithium-ion batteries as well. So he's actually lining all these up, which then means he can send these basically to the grid. He can send them into his vehicles. You know, when you and from a lithium-ion battery recycling perspective, they can there's a new company, so it's called ET. They can recycle lithium-ion batteries, so they can recycle about 97% of all of the battery to create a brand new recycled one. So from Elon Musk's case, he can create one battery, put it into your Tesla, leave it there for 10 years, take it out of that, put that into tied grid storage, and these lithium-ion batteries will last in tied grid storage or in grid-scale storage for about 22 plus years. So he actually has a massive secondary battery market coming down the line as well, let alone basically the solar stuff that he's up to.
So quick question on this issue. Who here today has an electric vehicle? Can I see hands? Who has one? You have one, sir? You do? Yes? You do? Yes? That's 3 people in the room. Okay. Similar question, but different. 2030. Who thinks they will have an electric vehicle by 2030? Does anyone think they'll still have an internal combustion engine vehicle in 2030? Oh, you do. But is that just for fun because you like the way that the Ferrari sounds? Yeah. But for day-to-day transport, electric. Yeah.
But this is the thing. And then when you have a look at the internal combustion engine, by 2030, 2040, depending on the particular governments, they're just banning the sale of them. So we have this transition. But then if we sort of really want to take it a step further, so what I've done is I've found a way to eliminate lithium-ion batteries basically from an electric vehicle because I can wirelessly charge it. However, if I don't have the wireless charging infrastructure basically up the Sheikh Zayed Road or within the sort of different street furniture around here, that doesn't necessarily matter. Because on the one hand, the same creative artificial intelligences that created Toyota's EV battery in 16 days are also creating spray-on solar. Now, spray-on solar, which it should arrive about 2026 in the labs, really, because it's complicated. What we can do is we can create a spray-on photovoltaic material that has antennae, nanosensors embedded within it, as well as wireless charging systems. And so I could spray, and this is courtesy of MIT, I could spray that glass, and that glass will now generate it with solar. That glass will generate electricity from the ambient light, and I've got a story about that as well, and then wirelessly transmit it to over there. And from an Internet of Things perspective, I can have strain gauges in that spray-on material that detects the glass is half full, half empty, whatever it happens to be, that I'm picking it up, I'm doing whatever. So we have some literally sci-fi things coming through. And then from the future of solar perspective, because when we talk about hydrogen versus solar versus wind, we have a pathway right now to creating solar concentrators that are 132% energy efficient. So you've got a 6 gigawatt solar farm, basically. When you sort of go and buy your solar panels, most solar panels are silicon solar panels today. They're about 17 to 22% energy efficient. We can get silicon up to about 28% energy efficient. We can get perovskite to about 32% energy efficient. Bearing in mind that the cost of solar is now, according to the IEA, the cheapest form of electricity in history, because we're at about $20 to $30 per megawatt hour, with some other countries up at about the $60 range. And also, Bloomberg Neff basically state that solar generation is now the cheapest form of electricity in 68 countries. You know, there's writing on the wall here, you know, the trends are talking. But moving from perovskite, we can do some rather strange things now. So courtesy of the Chinese, if you use hybrid bacteria, so genetically engineered bacteria, we can create solar panels that are 50% energy efficient, that generate electricity even when it's cloudy and dusty. We have a solar panel at the US Department of Energy that is 48% efficient. These exist. These aren't fiction. They're not theoretical any longer.
So 48% efficient as opposed to the ones out in
17,
Masdar
yeah,
here?
yeah.
Similar?
Yeah, so triple the efficiency.
Okay.
Now, starting to step it up. If I put carbon nanotubes into a traditional silicon solar panel to reclaim the heat, I have a solar panel that is 80% energy efficient. If I put graphene over the top of a solar panel, I can generate electricity from rain or snow. If I use 3D printing, I can, and we've done this, so by using 3D printing, I can 3D print a brand new material called a nanophotonic material that can capture all of the smallest wavelengths of light. And I create a product called black silicon. Black silicon has an energy efficiency of 132%, because for every photon that hits it, the material kicks out 1.3, you've got to average out, 1.3 electrons, which is where we get to a solar concentrator with 132% energy efficiency. Then you start putting that back to the oil and gas sector. Oil and gas prices do this. And industries hate that because governments hate that. Renewable energy, one of renewable energy's strengths basically is that it's predictable. And if you go and Google the cost of electricity generation from renewables, it's an exponential curve. It's doing this. When we have a look at wind, we've got General Electric developing new wind turbines, basically that are typically larger than 44 stories tall, basically that go in the deep sea. We have undersea substations. Yeah, so the cost of electricity generation alone from renewables is doing this. And then when we have a look at installations, last year we had 250 gigawatts of renewables installed versus 60 gigawatts from new fossil fuel installations. The whole industry is not only being disrupted, but it's in this massive transition period, and transition periods are incredibly painful, because if you have a look at the halls outside, how many people work in the oil and gas industry? How many partners and suppliers are there? Look at the ecosystems. The ecosystem for the oil and gas industry is massive. The first crude oil was used by the Babylonians basically in 5000 AD, and yet now, all of a sudden, because of climate change and the fossil fuel emissions are actually catching up with us, we're in this state of going, so what we have a centuries-old industry or a millennial-old industry. And what we want to do is we want to revolutionize that really within about 10 years. If we're kind, we could say 20 years. And if you sort of speak to Greta Thunberg, she'd like it done tomorrow. And this is the thing, this is sort of where when we look at the future, when we have a look at the future and when we have a look at transitioning, you have startups that are creating some of these new energy technologies that I've talked about. You then have the investors sitting in the middle that say, we like these new technologies and we want to be able to deploy them because it helps reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Then you have the multinationals. And from a multinational's perspective, whether it's ADNOC, whether it's Shell, whether it's Exxon, BP, whoever it happens to be, they are the ones that need to help deploy it. Because the one-man band basically out there basically is not going to be able to deploy a massive gigawatt solar farm. So what we actually need is we need a partnership between inventors, so research and development, inventors, academic, innovators, startups, companies basically with entrepreneurship programs who are doing new things in new ways. We need a link basically with investors. And when you have a look at ESG investing is now at $34 trillion worth of assets under management. By 2050, it's estimated that ESG investments will be $50 trillion, which will be over 35% of all assets under management. So the money men basically come and say, okay, we need to transition, here's money, which then actually gives the oil and gas industry quite a big problem. Because I work with a huge number of investors. We've got about $12 trillion under investment. If investors are actually pulling money out of your stocks and your companies, where are you going to get the money that you need to help with the transition? And that's kind of some of the short-sightedness that actually I don't think society is generally picking up on. But then once you have the money, it's a case of, here's X billion dollars, now go and build the stuff. And the more money that we have, It's estimated that to get to net zero, we need to invest $92 trillion by 2050. At the moment, we're investing about $1.7 trillion, and we need to get that up to about $4 to $5 trillion a year in order to actually hit net zero targets. We've got the technologies. We've got the companies out there that know how to deploy this stuff at scale, all the way around the world, everywhere, from the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, basically, to the middle of the desert. You need the money in the middle. And when we bring these three systems together, that's how we accelerate the transition. And from a societal perspective, we accelerate our progress against global emissions, and so we start solving climate change. But then from an industry perspective, the world's biggest problems are the world's biggest business opportunities. And if you can actually make that transition, then on the one hand, basically, you sort of own the old world of energy. But under this system, you own the new world of energy as well. But it's clean.
So, we've only got a couple of minutes left. To wrap up, this has major implications for society and the future of the planet. I don't care. I present a radio show called The Business Breakfast, and all I care about is me and making money. Yep. So let's play a little game of long or short, and tell me what I should be investing my money in for my retirement. I'm turn 50 next year. Long or short, the oil price for my retirement?
No. So to quote Bloomberg, basically the oil prices are now generally disconnected from the global economy. If you step back to the 1980s when oil prices were high, that sent shocks all the way around the world. Oil's ability to shock the global economic system is now reduced.
Okay, so short oil prices over the long term. What about some of these big energy companies that we see behind us, the lovely sponsors of ADIPEC?
Yeah,
Are we long or short ExxonMobil?
Okay, so ExxonMobil, so I spoke basically to the CEO basically of ExxonMobil. On the one hand, basically, they see the transition basically away from oil and gas, obviously, basically as a Titanic event. But actually, they also see new opportunities, for example, basically with production, moving into chemicals, basically as we've actually seen basically with ADNOC, basically and a couple of others, as well as Aramco. So I remember Aramco giving me a call literally like 4 or 5 years ago talking about innovation. That was a weird one. So BP are trying to become an integrated energy company. This is the thing, and no longer oil and gas companies, now energy companies and integrated energy companies. We're seeing that marketing and that rebranding.
Well, you can see it with the Total logo, can't you? Nice, lovely Total Energies logo.
Yeah, I mean, it's nice and pretty and all that kind of stuff. So we've got BP, basically they're trying to become an integrated energy company. They've got BP Ventures. They're actually going to these startups here. They're providing the money, and then they're providing the expertise to push this stuff into the market. Hydrogen, solar, renewables, all that sort of stuff.
So do I buy the shares? Do I buy big energy stocks, long or short?
Actually, for the ones that are actually making the transition, I would actually buy, because the reason for that is essentially they're on the ground floor. When you actually have a look at new business models and new operating models, basically for the energy industry, we've got the rise of microgrids, we've got tide storage, virtual power plants, autonomous energy grids coming through, we've got electric vehicles basically coming through. If you are an oil and gas company and you can actually transition fast enough to own, should we say, the electrification industry, to be honest, basically that's the new Amazon. That's a multi-trillion-dollar stock right there.
Which one?
BP. So, well, likes of BP. And they've got a way to go. But if you think about it, BP moved from we dig stuff out of the ground to we provide the energy, we provide the global energy to power your 20 million electric vehicles, Elon Musk. As well as your homes.
Which brings me on to my next one. We've got 1 minute left. Long or short Tesla?
Long.
Because?
Because Elon Musk basically is not only building Tesla, what he's actually doing is he's building a multi-sided platform business. So what he has is he has Tesla today. It's a $1 trillion stock. He has Starlink. So Starlink, basically, they're launching 12,000 satellites into low Earth orbit to connect the entire planet. 3.5 billion people on the planet are not connected. Now, Starlink basically can provide 200 megabit a second broadband at 5 millisecond delays to any point on Earth. So on the one hand, Elon Musk can go to 3.5 billion people and say, by the way, you aren't connected to the internet today. Would you like to be, and get a subscription? Secondly, all the electric vehicles that he's producing, at the minute you link to Vodacom or whatever it happens to be, you link straight into Tesla's own communication system. Thirdly, he's got Solar City, basically, which isn't doing very well. He's also got SpaceX. So SpaceX is typically feeding into Tesla stocks, and they've got a diversification share. And when you actually have a look at SpaceX, SpaceX has reduced the cost of launching satellites and stuff into space by 99%. It's not Tesla. Elon Musk is building a hardware-based, multi-sided platform that feeds into everything. OpenAI he's now come out of OpenAI, but OpenAI is a developing artificial general intelligence. And on the one hand, he can actually use artificial intelligence in the Teslas to reduce energy consumption to improve battery life. But also, weird fact, he can actually use the artificial intelligences that OpenAI create to create a fully autonomous pilot, basically for the Starship Heavy, so that when it lands on Mars, it lands. Because it's estimated that if you want to land a spaceship on Mars, no human's going to be able to manage it, because at the minute NASA use sky cranes. And so you need an automated system to land on Mars. And actually up the road, is it that way or that way, you've got the UAE Mars city being built.
Yes.
And so...
Last question. We're out of time. Last question. 2031 ADIPEC. 10 years from now, November 2031. Yes or no? Is the opening keynote speech given by the new Secretary General of the United Nations, Greta Thunberg?
No.
No. We shall see.
It would be interesting.
Matt Griffin, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.